I'd been planning this hike for weeks. The Bartram Trail in North Carolina had been on my list for years, and late October seemed like the perfect time to finally do it. The leaves would be at their peak, the crowds would be gone, and I'd have the trail mostly to myself. I'm not the type who needs company when I'm out there. In fact, I prefer it. There's something about being alone in the woods that clears my head in a way nothing else can. So when I parked at the trailhead that Wednesday morning, seeing no other cars in the lot felt like a good sign. The weather was perfect, cool, but not cold. The kind of crisp autumn air that makes you feel alive. I adjusted my pack, checked my map one last time, and started walking. The trail was well marked, easy to follow, and the scenery was exactly what I'd hoped for. The trees were a riot of color: reds, oranges, yellows, and the forest floor was carpeted with fallen leaves that crunched softly under my boots. For the first hour or so, everything was exactly as it should be. I fell into a rhythm, one foot in front of the other, breathing steady, mind quiet. I passed a few interesting landmarks: a large boulder with moss growing up one side, a creek that ran parallel to the trail for a while, a massive oak tree that must have been hundreds of years old. I made mental notes of them, the way you do when you're hiking alone. Little breadcrumbs to help you remember where you've been. Around the 2-hour mark, I started to notice something strange. There was a tree stump on the left side of the trail. Nothing remarkable about it, really. Just an old stump, maybe 3 feet wide, with a few mushrooms growing on top. But I could have sworn I'd seen it before. I stopped and stared at it for a moment, trying to place it in my memory. Yeah, I definitely passed this stump about 20 minutes ago. I was sure of it. I pulled out my map and checked my position. According to the map, I was moving forward. The trail didn't loop back on itself. There were no switchbacks in this section. It was a straightforward path, heading northeast. I looked at the stump again, then at the trail ahead. Maybe I was mistaken. Maybe there were just a lot of similar-looking stumps out here. I shook it off and kept walking. But 20 minutes later, I saw it again. The same stump, the same mushrooms, the same fallen log lying next to it. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart started beating a little faster. This didn't make sense. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The trees looked the same, the trail looked the same, but I knew I hadn't turned around. I'd been walking in a straight line the whole time. I opened my pack and pulled out a small roll of bright orange surveyor's tape that I always carry for emergencies. I tore off a piece and tied it around a low branch next to the stump. Then I took a photo of it with my phone, just to be sure. I checked the time. It was 11:43 a.m. I made a mental note and started walking again, this time paying much closer attention to my surroundings. I walked for what felt like 10 minutes, maybe 15. I counted my steps for a while, then gave up. The trail continued ahead, winding gently through the trees. And then I saw it, the orange tape, tied exactly where I'd left it. My stomach dropped. I walked up to the stump and stared at the tape, then at the photo on my phone. It was the same, exactly the same. The timestamp on the photo read 11:43 a.m. It was now 11:56 a.m. I stood there for a long moment, trying to process what was happening. I'd walked for 13 minutes, in a straight line, and I'd ended up back where I started. That wasn't possible. I turned around slowly, looking at the trail behind me. It stretched away into the trees, just like it should. No curves, no loops, just a straight path disappearing into the forest. I decided to try something different. I turned around and started walking back the way I'd come. If I'd somehow gotten turned around without realizing it, retracing my steps should get me back to the trailhead. But as I walked, I started to notice things that didn't make sense. The trees looked different, thicker, closer together. The light filtering through the canopy seemed dimmer, even though it was barely noon. I should have been passing landmarks I'd seen on the way in: the boulder, the creek, the oak tree, but I didn't see any of them. After about an hour of walking, I started to feel genuinely uneasy. I should have been back at the trailhead by now, or at least close, but the trail just kept going. No landmarks, no signs, just endless forest. And then, impossibly, I saw the stump again. The same stump, with my orange tape still tied to the branch. I pulled out my phone. No signal. I'd known that would be the case. This area was notorious for bad reception, but I'd hoped maybe I'd get lucky. I sat down on the fallen log next to the stump and tried to think. This didn't make sense. None of it made sense. I'm not someone who panics easily, but I could feel the edges of it creeping in. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to think logically. Maybe I'd gotten disoriented. Maybe I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere without realizing it. But I'd been following the trail markers, the white blazes painted on the trees. They'd been there the whole time. I looked around and spotted one about 50 feet ahead. I stood up and walked over to it. Yeah, white blaze. Standard Appalachian trail marking. I was on the right trail. I decided to keep moving. Standing still wasn't going to help. I started walking again, keeping my eyes on the trail markers, making sure I didn't miss a turn. The forest was completely silent now. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my boots on the leaves. And then I heard something else. Footsteps. I stopped, listened. They were coming from somewhere behind me. Slow, deliberate, the steady crunch, crunch, crunch of someone walking on the trail. I turned around, expecting to see another hiker, but there was no one there. The trail was empty. I waited. The footsteps continued. They weren't getting louder or quieter, just constant, like whoever was making them was keeping pace with me, always just out of sight. I called out, "Hello?" The footsteps stopped. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. Nothing. Is someone there? Silence. I turned around and started walking again, faster this time. The footsteps started up again almost immediately. Same pace, same rhythm. I stopped. They stopped. I started. They started. My pulse was hammering now. I looked around, trying to see into the trees, but the forest was too thick, too dark. I started jogging. The footsteps matched my speed. I broke into a run. So did they. I didn't look back. I just ran. My pack bounced against my back. My lungs burned. I didn't care. I just needed to get away from whatever was behind me. I don't know how long I ran. 10 minutes, maybe 20. But eventually, I burst through a line of trees and stumbled onto a paved road. I bent over, gasping for air, my hands on my knees. I looked back at the forest. The footsteps had stopped. Everything was quiet. The road was empty. No cars, no houses. Just asphalt stretching away in both directions. I pulled out my phone. Still no signal. But I had GPS. I opened the map and waited for it to load. When it finally did, I stared at the screen in disbelief. According to the GPS, I'd walked in a perfect circle, 3 times. The trail I'd been following should have been a straight line heading northeast. But the GPS showed me looping back on myself, over and over, like I'd been walking in circles for hours. The distance I'd covered was over 8 miles, but I'd ended up less than 2 miles from where I started. I walked along the road until I found a small country store. The woman behind the counter gave me a strange look when I walked in, muddy and disheveled, but she let me use her phone to call a friend to come pick me up. While I waited, I asked her about the trail. She frowned. "Bartram Trail?" she said. "Yeah, we get hikers coming through here sometimes, but we also get a fair number who come out looking like you do, shaken up, lost, talking about things that don't make sense." "What kind of things?" I asked. She shrugged. "Trails that loop when they shouldn't, people following them that they never see, sounds in the woods, that sort of thing. Some folks say the forest doesn't like visitors, that it plays tricks on people who go in alone." I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't. I never went back to finish that hike. I tell myself it was just disorientation, that I got turned around somehow and my mind filled in the gaps with fear. But I still have the photo of that stump, with my orange tape tied to the branch, and when I look at it, I can still hear those footsteps, slow, deliberate, always just behind me. I started the hike early that morning, just after sunrise. It was early April, and the mountains in Tennessee were still holding on to the last bit of winter. The air was sharp and cold, the kind that stings your lungs when you breathe too deep. I'd planned a simple day hike to one of the shelters about 6 miles up the trail. Nothing too ambitious, just a chance to get out and clear my head after a long winter cooped up inside. The parking area at the trailhead was empty when I arrived. No surprise there. Midweek in early spring isn't exactly peak hiking season. Most people wait until the weather warms up a bit, but I've always preferred hiking when the trails are quiet. There's something about the solitude that I find comforting, or at least I used to. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail was in decent shape, though there were a few patches of ice in the shaded areas where the sun hadn't reached yet. I kept a steady pace, my breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The forest was quiet, too quiet maybe. I didn't hear any birds, which struck me as odd. But I didn't think much of it at the time. Sometimes the woods are just like that. I stopped once to eat a granola bar and check my map. According to my phone, I was making good time. I'd covered about 3.5 miles in just under 2 hours. At this rate, I'd reach the shelter by late afternoon, have some time to rest, and then head back before dark. Simple plan, clean execution. I was feeling good as I started walking again. My legs were warm, my pack felt light, and the trail ahead was clear. And then, around 4 p.m., I saw him. He was maybe 100 yards ahead of me, walking in the same direction. Tall guy, maybe 6 feet, 6'1". He was wearing a dark jacket, black or maybe navy blue, and jeans. His pace was slow, methodical. Not the pace of someone in a hurry, but not a casual stroll either, just steady. I called out, "Hey, how's it going?" He didn't respond, didn't even turn around. I figured he had earbuds in. A lot of people hike with music these days. I don't, personally. I like to hear what's around me, but to each their own. I kept walking. I'm a pretty fast hiker, and I assumed I'd catch up to him eventually. But as the minutes passed, I realized something strange. The distance between us wasn't changing. I was walking at my normal pace, probably 3 miles an hour. Maybe a little faster, but he stayed the same distance ahead of me. Always about 100 yards. Never closer, never farther. I picked up my pace a little. Still nothing. The gap remained constant. I could see him clearly. The dark jacket, the way his arms swung slightly as he walked. But no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't close the distance. After about 20 minutes of this, I started to feel frustrated. I'm not a competitive person by nature, but there was something unsettling about watching someone walk at what should have been a slower pace than mine and somehow staying ahead. It didn't make sense. I decided to jog, just to see what would happen. I broke into a light jog, my pack bouncing slightly against my back. I kept my eyes on the figure ahead. He didn't speed up. His pace remained exactly the same. Slow, steady, methodical, but I still didn't get any closer. If anything, it felt like the distance was stretching, like the trail itself was expanding between us. I jogged for maybe 5 minutes before I had to stop. My lungs were burning from the cold air, and my legs were starting to protest. I bent over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. When I looked up, he was still there, still walking, still the same distance ahead. I started walking again, slower this time. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe the trail was playing tricks on my depth perception. Maybe he was farther away than I thought. Maybe I was just tired and my mind was filling in gaps that weren't there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The trail curved ahead, disappearing into a thick stand of pines. I watched as the figure rounded the bend and went out of sight. Good, I thought. Maybe when I get around that curve, I'll see where he went. Maybe there's a side trail I didn't notice on the map. I walked to the bend and rounded it. The trail ahead was straight, perfectly straight. I could see at least half a mile in front of me. No curves, no side paths, no thick trees to hide behind, and no hiker. He was gone. I stopped, looked around. The forest on either side of the trail was sparse here. Bare trees, no undergrowth thick enough to conceal a person. I should have been able to see him. He couldn't have gotten that far ahead in the few seconds it took me to round the bend, and there was nowhere for him to go. I stood there for a long moment, listening. No footsteps, no rustling leaves, no sound of someone moving through the woods, just silence. That same heavy silence I'd noticed earlier. I called out again. Hello? Nothing. I walked forward slowly, scanning the trees on both sides of the trail. Maybe he'd stepped off to take a break, or to relieve himself. But there was no sign of him. No broken branches, no disturbed leaves, nothing. I looked down at the trail. The ground was soft here, a mix of dirt and old leaves. I could see my own boot prints clearly, but there were no other prints. None. Just mine, stretching back the way I'd come. My chest tightened. I felt a cold prickle run down my spine. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe he'd turned back somehow and I'd missed him. Maybe he'd taken a side trail I hadn't seen. But I didn't believe it. I'd been watching him the entire time. and there were no side trails. I stood there for another minute, maybe two, just staring at the empty trail ahead. Then I made a decision. I needed to get to the shelter. I needed to be somewhere that felt less exposed, less alone. I started walking again, faster this time. I didn't run. I didn't want to run. But I moved with purpose, my eyes constantly scanning the trail ahead, the trees on either side. I kept expecting to see him again, to round another bend and find him standing there, waiting. But I didn't. The trail stayed empty. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky by the time I reached the shelter. It was a simple three-sided structure with a raised wooden platform for sleeping and a metal roof. Standard Appalachian trail shelter. I'd stayed in dozens like it over the years. But this one felt different, unwelcoming, somehow. I dropped my pack and sat down on the edge of the platform, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was just the cold, but I knew better. There was a logbook inside the shelter. Most AT shelters have them. People sign in, leave little notes about their hike, draw pictures, share trail gossip. I pulled it out and flipped through the entries. The most recent one was dated 4 days ago. A through hiker passing through. Before that, another hiker a week prior. No one else. No one had signed in today. No one had been on this trail. But I'd seen him. I'd watched him walk ahead of me for almost half an hour. I'd seen the way his jacket moved, the way his arms swung. He was real. He had to be real. I sat there as the light faded, staring at the empty trail. I didn't build a fire. I didn't cook dinner. I just sat there, wrapped in my sleeping bag, watching the shadows grow longer. I kept waiting for him to appear, to walk out of the trees and explain everything, to tell me he'd taken a shortcut, or that I'd been seeing things, or that there was some perfectly reasonable explanation for what had happened. But he never came. As darkness settled over the shelter, I heard something, faint at first, the sound of footsteps, slow, steady, coming from somewhere out in the trees. I sat up, my heart pounding. The footsteps continued for maybe 30 seconds. Then they stopped. I waited. Nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there in the dark, listening to the silence, jumping at every small sound. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I packed up and started back down the trail. I moved fast. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. When I got back to my car, I sat there for a long time, just staring at the trailhead. I thought about reporting what I'd seen. To who I didn't know. The Park Service, the police, and tell them what? That I'd seen a hiker who disappeared? That there were no footprints? They'd think I was crazy. I haven't been back to that trail. I've thought about it. Thought about going back in the daylight with a friend. Thought about trying to find some explanation. But every time I think about it, I remember that figure. The dark jacket. The slow, steady pace. The way he never turned around. And I remember the silence. That heavy, oppressive silence that filled the forest. I saw someone that day. I know I did. But the more time passes, the more I wonder if what I saw was really a person at all, or if it was something else. Something that walks those trails. Something that doesn't leave footprints. Something that's always just ahead, just out of reach, leading people deeper into the woods. I still hike, but I don't go alone anymore. And I never look too closely at the figures I see ahead of me on the trail, because part of me is afraid that if I catch up, if I finally close that distance, I'll see something I'm not supposed to see. Something that will make me understand why there were no footprints, why no one else had been on that trail, and why sometimes, in the mountains, it's better not to follow. I'd been planning the trip for months, 3 days, solo, deep into the Smokies. I wanted to disconnect completely. No phone service, no people, just me and the mountains. The first day went exactly as planned. I covered about 8 miles, set up camp near a small creek, and slept better than I had in months. The sound of running water has always put me at ease. The second day started off clear and cool. I broke camp around 7, ate a quick breakfast, and got back on the trail. My plan was to hike another 10 miles or so, but around midday, I started feeling restless. The trail I was on was well traveled, and even though I hadn't seen anyone that morning, I could see the signs of other hikers. Boot prints, granola bar wrappers that someone had missed when packing out their trash. I wanted something more remote, more untouched, so I went off trail. I'm experienced enough to know the risks. I had a compass, a GPS unit, and a topographic map. I wasn't going far, just a mile or two into the woods to see what was out there. Maybe find a nice spot to have lunch away from the main path. I marked my position on the GPS and started walking east into a thick stretch of forest that looked like it hadn't seen a human being in years. The terrain was rough, steep inclines, fallen trees, dense undergrowth that grabbed at my pants' legs, but it was beautiful. Old-growth forest, massive oaks and pines, the kind of woods that feel ancient, sacred, almost. I walked for about 45 minutes, taking my time, enjoying the solitude. That's when I found the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across. The structure was old, really old. The wood was rotted and gray, covered in places by thick vines that had climbed up the sides and over the roof. The windows were broken, just jagged shards of glass still clinging to the frames. The front porch sagged at one end, like it might collapse if you put any weight on it. Everything about the place screamed abandoned, forgotten, a relic from another time. But there was smoke coming from the chimney. I stopped at the edge of the clearing and stared. Thin, gray smoke rising steadily into the sky. Fresh smoke, I could smell it. Wood burning, not the acrid smell of wet wood or trash. Clean smoke, like someone had just built a fire with dry, seasoned logs. I stood there for a full minute, trying to make sense of it. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for decades, maybe longer, but someone was inside. Someone was burning a fire. I called out, "Hello? Anyone home?" No answer, just the sound of wind moving through the trees. I waited, called out again. Nothing. I should have left. Every instinct in my body was telling me to turn around and walk back to the trail. But curiosity is a powerful thing. And stupid. I walked toward the cabin slowly, my eyes on the windows, looking for any sign of movement inside. The front door was cracked open, just a few inches, enough to see darkness beyond. I stepped up onto the porch carefully, testing each board before putting my full weight on it. The wood groaned, but held. I knocked on the door frame. "Hello? I'm just a hiker." I saw the smoke, just wanted to make sure everything's okay. Still no answer. I pushed the door open. It creaked on rusty hinges, loud enough to make me wince. I stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was worse than the outside. Dust covered everything. Thick layers of it on the floor, the windowsills, the broken furniture scattered around the room. There was a table in one corner, its surface warped and cracked. A few chairs, one of them overturned. Shelves on the walls that had probably held supplies once, but were now empty except for cobwebs. The place looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry and never touched since, except for the fire. In the center of the room was a stone fireplace, and in that fireplace was a fire, a real fire, burning strong, fresh logs, thick and dry, crackling as they burned. No ash buildup at the base, no charred remnants of previous fires. Someone had built this fire recently, within the last hour, maybe. I stood there, staring at it. My brain was trying to process what I was seeing, but it didn't make sense. The cabin was clearly abandoned, but the fire was real. I could feel the heat coming off it. I could hear the wood popping. "Hello?" I called out again, louder this time. "Is someone here?" No response. But as I stood there, I noticed something else. On the table in the corner, a plate. I walked over to it slowly. On the plate were beans, cornbread, a fork sitting next to it, and the food was still warm. I reached out and touched the plate. Heat radiated through the ceramic. Someone had been eating here, minutes ago, maybe less. My heart started to beat faster. I looked around the room, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. There was a doorway at the back that led to what looked like a small hallway, and beyond that, stairs, leading up. I shouldn't have stayed. I should have walked out right then. But I was frozen. My mind was racing, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe it was a squatter, someone living off the grid. But then why wouldn't they answer? Why leave their food? That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, slow, coming from upstairs. The sound was unmistakable. The creak of old wood under weight. One step, then another. Deliberate, methodical, moving across the floor above me. I didn't think. I just ran. I bolted out of that cabin so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. I hit the porch, jumped down into the clearing, and started running back the way I'd come. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at my face, my pack bouncing hard against my back. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't slow down. I don't know how long I ran, 10 minutes, 15, but eventually I stumbled back onto the main trail. I stood there, bent over, gasping for air, my hands on my knees. My whole body was shaking. I forced myself to calm down, to breathe, to think. I pulled out my GPS and checked my position. I was back on the trail, safe. I looked at the route I'd taken off trail. It was right there on the screen, a clear path leading east from the main trail to the clearing where I'd found the cabin. I made camp that night about 3 miles further up the trail. I didn't build a fire. I just sat in my tent, staring at the mesh door, listening to every sound, every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch. I barely slept. The next morning I packed up and started heading back toward the trailhead. My plan had been to spend one more night in the backcountry, but I was done. I just wanted to get out. On my way back, I passed a ranger station. I almost didn't stop. Part of me didn't want to talk about what I'd seen, didn't want to sound crazy, but I couldn't shake the image of that cabin, the fire, the food, the footsteps. I went inside. There was a ranger behind the desk, an older guy with a gray beard. I told him what I'd found, described the cabin, showed him on my map exactly where I'd been. He listened, his expression neutral. When I finished, he shook his head. "There aren't any cabins in that area," he said. "Not anymore. There used to be some old homesteads back in the 30s and 40s, but they were all torn down or fell apart decades ago." "I'm telling you, it was there," I said. "I was inside. There was a fire, fresh food." He looked at me for a long moment. "Son, I've been working these mountains for 20 years. I know every structure, every old foundation, every pile of rocks that used to be a chimney. There's nothing where you're saying you were." I pulled out my GPS, showed him the route I'd taken. He studied it, then looked up at me with something that might have been concern or pity. I couldn't tell. "You must have gotten turned around," he said. "It happens, especially when you go off trail. The mind can play tricks on you out there." I didn't argue. There was no point. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I'd heard. I left the ranger station and drove home. For the next few weeks, I tried to convince myself that maybe he was right. Maybe I'd gotten disoriented. Maybe I'd stumbled onto some squatter's camp and my mind had filled in the details wrong. But I couldn't shake it. The image of that cabin, the smoke rising from the chimney, the warmth of the plate. About a month later, I was looking through some old archives online, historical records of the Smokies. I was curious, wanted to see if I could find any information about old homesteads in the area where I'd been. I found a few references. Families who'd lived in those mountains before the national park was established. Most of them had been relocated, their homes torn down. But there was one story that stuck with me. A cabin that had belonged to a family named Haskins. They'd lived deep in the woods, miles from anyone else. The cabin had been abandoned in the winter of 1934 after the father disappeared. Just vanished one day. Searchers found the cabin weeks later. The fire was still burning, food still on the table, but the family was gone. The location matched where I'd been, almost exactly. I don't hike solo anymore, and I don't go off trail, because I know what I saw that day. I know what I heard, and I know that some places in those mountains don't follow the rules we think they should. Some places exist in their own time, and some fires keep burning long after they should have gone out. I'd chosen early November for the hike because I wanted to avoid the crowds. The Pisgah National Forest is beautiful that time of year, and most of the leaf peepers have already gone home by then. I'm not big on running into other hikers every few minutes. I like the quiet, the solitude, or at least I used to. The forecast had called for clear skies all day, cool temperatures, maybe in the low 50s, but nothing I couldn't handle. I started out around 9 in the morning from a trailhead off the Blue Ridge Parkway. The plan was simple, a 10-mile loop that would take me through some of the more remote sections of the forest. I'd done parts of it before, but never the whole thing in one go. The first few hours were perfect. Clear skies, crisp air, the kind of day that reminds you why you love the mountains. I made good time, stopping only once to refill my water bottle at a creek. By early afternoon, I'd covered about 6 miles and was feeling strong. The trail had taken me deep into the forest, away from the road, away from any signs of civilization. Just me and the trees. That's when the weather changed. It happened fast. One minute the sky was blue. The next, clouds were rolling in from the west, thick and gray, and moving with purpose. Within 15 minutes, the temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees. I pulled on my jacket and kept walking. I've been caught in mountain weather before. It's unpredictable. You learn to roll with it. But then the fog came. It didn't drift in gradually like fog usually does. It just appeared. One moment I could see 50 yards ahead of me. The next, I couldn't see more than 10 feet. Thick, white fog that swallowed everything. The trees became shadows. The trail markers were barely visible. I stopped and pulled out my headlamp, even though it was only mid-afternoon. The beam cut through the fog maybe 15 feet before being swallowed completely. I checked my map. According to my GPS, I was about 4 miles from the trailhead. The trail ahead was straightforward. No major intersections or confusing junctions. I just needed to keep following the blazes, and I'd be fine. I put my head down and kept walking. That's when I heard the voices. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But as I stopped and listened, I realized it was more than that. It sounded like people talking, faint, distant, like a conversation happening somewhere ahead of me on the trail. 2 people, maybe 3. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the cadence, the back and forth rhythm of people speaking. I felt a wave of relief. Other hikers. I wasn't alone out here. I called out, "Hey, hello." The voices stopped immediately. Complete silence. I waited, listening. Nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. "Hello?" I called again. Still nothing. I shrugged it off. Maybe they hadn't heard me. Sound does weird things in fog. I started walking again, following the trail markers. The fog seemed to be getting thicker, if that was even possible. I had to move slowly, carefully, checking for roots and rocks before each step. 5 minutes later, I heard the voices again. This time they were closer, much closer. Still somewhere ahead of me, but not as distant as before. I stopped and listened carefully. The cadence was the same, that rhythmic back and forth, but something about it felt wrong. The tone was too even, too calm. There was no variation in pitch or volume. It sounded less like a conversation and more like, I don't know, a recording maybe, something mechanical. I tried to focus on the words, but I couldn't make them out. They were muffled by the fog. I took a few steps forward, toward the sound. The voices continued, unchanging. I called out again. "I can hear you. Where are you?" The voices didn't stop this time. They just kept going. Same rhythm, same tone. I felt a prickle of unease run down my spine. Something about this wasn't right. I decided to follow the sound. It seemed to be coming from just off the trail, maybe 20 or 30 feet into the trees. I stepped off the path carefully, pushing through the undergrowth. The fog was even thicker here. I could barely see my own hand in front of my face, but the voices were getting louder. I pushed deeper into the trees. The ground was uneven, covered in leaves and fallen branches. I had to move slowly to avoid tripping. The voices were close now, so close it felt like they should be right in front of me, but I couldn't see anyone. Just fog. Thick, impenetrable fog. And then I realized something that made my blood run cold. They weren't speaking English. I stopped and listened more carefully. The sounds I was hearing weren't words, not in any language I'd ever heard. They weren't Spanish or French or German. They weren't even close. The sounds were wrong, too deep, too flat. Like someone had taken human speech and stripped away everything that made it human. What was left was just sound, mechanical, alien. I stood there, frozen, as the voices continued around me. They seemed to be coming from everywhere now, not from one direction, but from all directions, surrounding me. And the rhythm was changing, getting faster, more urgent. The sounds overlapping, creating a cacophony that made my skin crawl. I backed away slowly, trying to retrace my steps to the trail, but in the fog, everything looked the same. I couldn't tell which way I'd come from. The voices followed me, not getting quieter, not fading, just there. Always just out of sight, always just ahead or beside or behind me. Panic started to set in. I reached for my phone, hoping the GPS would at least show me which direction to go, But before I could pull it out, I noticed something else. A sound beneath the voices. A low hum, constant, steady, like the sound of machinery running somewhere deep underground. It vibrated through the soles of my boots, through my chest, into my bones. I didn't think. I just ran. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at my face, my pack bouncing hard against my back. I didn't know which direction I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to get away from those voices, away from that hum. My lungs burned. My legs screamed, but I didn't stop. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours. But eventually, the fog started to thin. I could see further, 20 feet, 30. The trees became more distinct. And then, suddenly, I broke through completely. The fog ended like a wall, and I stumbled out onto a paved road. I bent over, gasping for air, my hands on my knees. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I looked back at the fog. It hung there, thick and impenetrable, about 50 feet off the road. I couldn't see into it, couldn't see the forest beyond. It looked like a solid white wall. I pulled out my phone and checked my GPS. I was about 2 miles from the trailhead. Somehow, I'd managed to find my way out. I started walking along the road, my legs shaking, my whole body trembling. I just wanted to get to my car, to get out of there. When I finally reached the parking area, I sat in my car for a long time, just staring at the steering wheel. My hands were still shaking. I tried to calm down, to rationalize what I'd experienced. Maybe the fog had disoriented me. Maybe the sounds I'd heard were just wind or animals, or some acoustic trick of the terrain. Maybe I'd panicked for no reason. But then I remembered something. I'd been running a recording app on my phone. I always do when I hike alone. It's a safety precaution. If something happens to me, at least there might be some record of it. I pulled out my phone and opened the app. The recording was still running. It had been going for over 6 hours. I scrolled to the timestamp when I'd heard the voices and hit play. At first, all I heard was wind, the sound of my footsteps on the trail, my breathing, normal hiking sounds. And then, around the time I'd first heard the voices, there was nothing, no voices, just wind. I fast-forwarded a bit, still nothing. But then, as I got to the part where I'd gone off trail, I heard it, the hum. That low, constant hum I'd felt more than heard. It was there on the recording, clear as day, deep, unnatural, not like any sound that should exist in a forest. I listened for another minute. The hum continued, unchanging, underneath the sound of my panic breathing and the branches breaking as I ran. And then, just before I burst out of the fog, there was something else. A sound I hadn't heard when I was there. A voice, just one, speaking in that same flat, inhuman tone. I couldn't make out the words, but the voice was clear. It said something, 3 syllables, maybe 4, and then it stopped. I deleted the file immediately. I don't know why, instinct maybe, or fear. I just knew I didn't want it on my phone, didn't want any record of what I'd heard. I drove home in silence, didn't turn on the radio, didn't listen to music, just focused on the road and tried not to think about it. But I do think about it, all the time. I've tried to research what I experienced, looked up acoustic phenomena, electromagnetic interference, anything that might explain the voices and the hum. I haven't found anything that fits. Some people talk about infrasound, low-frequency sounds that can cause feelings of unease or fear. But that doesn't explain the voices. It doesn't explain why they sounded like that, why they weren't in any language. I haven't been back to Pisgah. I probably never will. Because part of me knows that whatever I heard in that fog wasn't natural, it wasn't human, and it wasn't meant for me to hear. I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I walked into something I shouldn't have, something that exists in those mountains, something that speaks in voices that don't belong to any living thing. And sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I think I can still hear it, that low hum, just at the edge of my hearing, constant, unnatural, waiting. I'd been planning the trip to Linville Gorge for weeks. Late September is one of my favorite times to camp in North Carolina. The summer crowds are gone, the weather's still decent, and the fall colors are just starting to show. I wanted a few days alone in the backcountry, just me, my tent, and the wilderness. A chance to disconnect and recharge. I hiked in on a Thursday afternoon. The trailhead parking lot was empty except for my car, which was exactly what I wanted to see. I shouldered my pack and started the descent into the gorge. The trail was steep and rocky, but I'd done it before. I knew what I was getting into. It took me about 2 hours to reach the spot I'd picked out on the map, a small clearing about a quarter mile from the river, tucked back in the trees. Far enough from the main trail that I wouldn't be disturbed, but close enough to water that I wouldn't have to haul it too far. Perfect. I set up camp methodically, pitched my tent on a flat spot, hung my food bag from a tree branch about 50 yards away to keep the bears out, and built a small fire ring. By 6 o'clock, everything was squared away. I sat on a log and ate a freeze-dried meal while watching the light fade through the trees. The forest was quiet, not silent, but peaceful. The sound of wind in the leaves, the occasional bird call, the distant rush of the river. Normal sounds. Comfortable sounds. As darkness settled in, I banked the fire and retreated to my tent. I'm not someone who stays up late when I'm camping. I like to wake up with the sun, so I try to get to sleep by 9 or 10. I crawled into my sleeping bag, read for a bit by headlamp, and then turned off the light. Within minutes, I was asleep. I don't know exactly what time I woke up. My watch said 2:17 a.m., but something had pulled me out of sleep. A sound. I lay there in the darkness, listening, trying to figure out what had woken me. And then I heard it again. Scratching. It was faint at first. So faint I thought maybe I was imagining it, but as I focused, the sound became clearer. Something was scratching at the side of my tent. Slow, deliberate, like fingernails dragging across fabric. The sound moved gradually from the foot of the tent toward the head, right next to where I was lying. I froze. Every muscle in my body went rigid. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened. The scratching continued for maybe 10 seconds. Then it stopped. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. 5 seconds, 10, 20. Nothing. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal maybe. A raccoon or a possum. But the sound hadn't been frantic or random like an animal would make. It had been methodical, purposeful, and it had moved in a straight line, like someone drawing their hand across the tent wall. The scratching started again, this time on the opposite side of the tent. The same slow, deliberate movement. I could hear it clearly now. The sound of something hard scraping against nylon. It moved from one end of the tent to the other, and then stopped again. I lay there, paralyzed, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to yell, to make noise, to scare away whatever was out there. But another part of me, the part that understands how vulnerable you are when you're alone in the wilderness at night, told me to stay quiet, to not draw attention, to wait it out. The scratching came again and again, each time from a different side of the tent, each time moving in that same slow, methodical pattern. It went on for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes. And then, finally, it stopped. I waited in the darkness, listening. My ears were straining so hard I could hear my own pulse. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Nothing. Just silence and the normal sounds of the forest. I slowly reached for my headlamp and turned it on. The inside of the tent looked normal. My gear was where I'd left it. Everything was fine. I unzipped the tent door as quietly as I could and stuck my head out. The moon was bright, nearly full, and I could see the clearing clearly. There was nothing there. No animals. No people. Nothing moving. I scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of what had been making that sound. Nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the tent completely. The air was cold, and I was only in my base layers, but I didn't care. I needed to see what had been out here. I walked slowly around the tent, shining my light on the ground. No tracks. No disturbed leaves. No sign that anything had been here. I checked the tent fabric, running my hand over the nylon, looking for tears or damage. Nothing. Whatever had been scratching hadn't left any marks. I stood there for a few more minutes, shining my light into the woods, listening. The forest was quiet, normal, like nothing had happened. Eventually, I convinced myself that I'd overreacted. Maybe it had been a small animal after all. Maybe the scratching had sounded more deliberate than it actually was. Maybe I'd been half asleep and my mind had exaggerated things. I went back inside the tent and zipped it up. I didn't sleep much after that. I just lay there, staring at the tent ceiling, listening. But the scratching didn't come back. When the first light of dawn started filtering through the trees, I felt a wave of relief. I'd made it through the night. I unzipped the tent and crawled out, stretching in the cool morning air. The forest looked peaceful, beautiful. It was hard to believe I'd been so scared just a few hours ago. I started breaking down camp, rolled up my sleeping bag, deflated my sleeping pad, and started packing my gear. I saved the tent for last. As I started pulling up the stakes, I noticed something, marks on the tent fabric. I stopped and looked closer. Handprints, all over the tent. Dozens of them, small handprints, like a child's, pressed into the fabric. They covered every side of the tent, overlapping in places, all pushed outward like someone had been pressing against the tent from the inside. My blood went cold. I stepped back and looked at the tent from a distance. The handprints were unmistakable, clear impressions in the nylon, each showing the outline of a palm and 4 fingers. Some were faint, barely visible. Others were darker, more pronounced. But they were everywhere. I walked around the tent slowly, counting. There were at least 40 or 50 of them, maybe more. They covered the sides, the top, even the rainfly, and they were all on the outside of the tent, pressed outward. But that didn't make any sense. I'd been inside the tent all night, alone. I hadn't touched the walls. I hadn't pressed my hands against the fabric. And even if I had, my hands were bigger than these prints. These were small, child-sized. I crouched down and examined one of the prints closely. It was perfectly formed. 5 fingers, a palm, even the creases in the skin were visible in the fabric. But it was impossible. There was no one else in that tent. I would have known. I would have felt it, wouldn't I? I stood up and backed away from the tent. My hands were shaking. My mind was racing, trying to find some explanation. Maybe the prints had been there before. Maybe I just hadn't noticed them. But I'd set up this tent dozens of times. I would have seen them, and besides, the fabric still looked pressed, like the prints were fresh. I thought about the scratching, the slow, deliberate scratching that had moved around the tent, and I realized something that made my skin crawl. The scratching hadn't been coming from outside. It had been coming from inside my tent. While I was in there, I didn't pack the tent properly. I just stuffed it into its bag, not bothering to fold it or roll it. I threw everything into my pack and started hiking out. I didn't stop to make breakfast, didn't stop to rest. I just walked, fast. I needed to get out of there. The hike back to the trailhead took half the time it had taken me to hike in. I practically ran up the steep sections, my pack bouncing against my back. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the trunk and got in. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm down. I drove home in a daze. When I got there, I unpacked everything except the tent. I left it in the trunk. For 2 days, I didn't touch it. I didn't want to look at it, didn't want to see those handprints again. On the 3rd day, I finally took it out. I unzipped the bag and pulled out the tent, laying it flat on my garage floor. The handprints were still there, just as clear as they'd been in the woods. I stood there staring at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. I took photos, measured some of the prints. The average size was about 3.5 inches from the base of the palm to the tip of the middle finger, the size of a small child's hand, maybe 6 or 7 years old. I searched online for explanations. Static electricity, condensation patterns, some kind of chemical reaction with the tent fabric. Nothing fit. Nothing explained why the prints were shaped like hands, why there were so many of them, why they were pressed outward. I threw the tent away. I didn't donate it, didn't try to clean it. I just stuffed it in a garbage bag and put it out with the trash. I bought a new tent, different brand, different color. I told myself it was time for an upgrade anyway. But I haven't been back to Linville Gorge. I've thought about it. Thought about going back to that clearing to see if I could find any answers. But I can't bring myself to do it, because deep down, I know I won't find anything. No footprints, no evidence. Nothing that would explain what happened that night. The thing that haunts me most isn't the scratching. It isn't even the handprints. It's the realization that I wasn't alone in that tent. That something was in there with me. Something small enough that I didn't feel it. Quiet enough that I didn't hear it breathe. Something that pressed its hands against the fabric from the inside while I lay there in the darkness, inches away, completely unaware. I still camp, but I don't go alone anymore. And on nights when I'm lying in my tent, Listening to the sounds of the forest, I sometimes catch myself holding my breath, listening, waiting for the sound of scratching, waiting to see if, this time, I'll feel the presence of something else in the tent with me, something small, something that leaves handprints. I'd picked a Tuesday for the hike because I wanted solitude. George Washington National Forest is popular on weekends, but midweek it's usually quiet. I got to the trailhead around 9 in the morning. The parking lot was empty, except for my car. Perfect. I locked up, shouldered my day pack, and hit the trail. It was one of those crisp October mornings where the air feels clean and the light comes through the trees at sharp angles. The trail I'd chosen was a moderate 8-mile loop that would take me through some nice overlooks and along a ridge. Nothing too challenging. Just a good day hike to clear my head. The first hour was exactly what I needed. The rhythm of walking, the sound of leaves crunching under my boots, the quiet. I passed a few interesting rock formations, stopped once to take a photo of a hawk circling overhead, and generally felt like I'd made the right decision to take the day off work. About an hour in, maybe a little more, I glanced behind me. Force of habit. When you're hiking alone, you tend to be more aware of your surroundings. That's when I saw him. A man, maybe 50 or 60 yards back. Hard to tell exactly. He was wearing dark clothes, a black or navy jacket, jeans, boots, average build, nothing remarkable. I couldn't see his face clearly from that distance, but I could tell he was looking in my direction, walking the same trail. I turned back around and kept going. It's not unusual to see other hikers, even on a weekday. I didn't think anything of it, but after another mile, I glanced back again. He was still there, same distance, maybe 50 yards. When I'd slowed down at one point to navigate some rocks, I'd expected him to close the gap, but he hadn't. When I'd sped up on a flat section, I'd expected him to fall further behind, but he hadn't done that either. The distance stayed constant. I stopped and took a water break, partially because I was thirsty, and partially because I wanted to see what he'd do. I pulled out my water bottle and took a long drink, watching him out of the corner of my eye. He stopped too, just stood there on the trail, didn't pull out water, didn't check his phone, didn't look around at the scenery, just stood there. I capped my bottle and started walking again. Within a few seconds, he started walking too. Same pace, same distance. A small knot of unease formed in my stomach. This was weird. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe the guy just happened to be walking at the same speed as me. Maybe he was lost in thought, not really paying attention to how close he was. Maybe he didn't realize he was making me uncomfortable. I picked up my pace, not running, but walking faster than before, deliberately. The trail here was wide and clear, easy walking. After a few minutes, I glanced back. Same distance. He'd matched my pace exactly. The knot in my stomach tightened. Okay, this was definitely weird. I decided to test it. Up ahead was a side trail that I knew made a short loop before reconnecting to the main path. It added maybe a quarter mile to the total hike. I took it. The side trail was narrower, more overgrown. I pushed through some branches and kept walking, checking behind me every 30 seconds or so. At first, I didn't see him. The trail curved, and he was out of sight. I felt a brief moment of relief. Maybe he'd stayed on the main trail. Maybe I'd been overthinking this. But then I came around another curve and looked back. There he was, still following, still the same distance behind me. My heart started beating faster. This wasn't a coincidence. He was deliberately following me. The side trail was clearly marked, but it wasn't the main route. You had to make a choice to take it, and he'd made the same choice I had. The side trail reconnected to the main path after about 10 minutes. I came out and turned left, continuing the loop. I walked faster now, my mind racing. What did this guy want? Was he dangerous? Should I confront him? Should I call someone? I pulled out my phone. No signal. Of course. I was deep in the forest, surrounded by ridges. I wouldn't have service for miles. I kept walking, my senses on high alert. Every few seconds, I looked back. He was always there, never closer, never farther, just there. And then I decided to try something. I stopped, turned around completely, and waved. A big, obvious wave. He stopped, didn't wave back, just stood there in the middle of the trail 50 yards away, looking at me. I yelled, "Can I help you? Are you following me?" No response. He just stood there. I couldn't see his face clearly from this distance, but I could tell he was looking directly at me, not moving, not speaking, just watching. "Hey," I yelled again. "What do you want?" "Nothing." I felt my chest tighten. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. I turned around and started walking again, faster now, almost jogging. My pack bounced against my back. I heard my breath coming harder. I checked behind me. He was walking again too. Same pace, same distance. I kept up the faster pace for nearly a mile. My legs were burning. Sweat was running down my back despite the cool air. I looked back again, hoping maybe I'd lost him. But no, there he was, still following. And then, after another few minutes, I looked back and he was gone. I stopped dead in my trail. I spun around, scanning the path behind me. Nothing. The trail was empty. I could see at least 100 yards back, and there was no one there. No figure in a dark jacket, no movement. I stood there, my chest heaving, trying to process what had just happened. Had he finally given up, taken a different trail, stopped to rest? I waited, listening, looking, nothing. Just the sound of wind in the trees and my own ragged breathing. Relief washed over me. He was gone. Whatever game he'd been playing, it was over. I could finish the hike in peace. I turned back around and started walking again, slower now, trying to calm down. My hands were still shaking. I told myself I'd overreacted. Maybe the guy had just been hiking at the same pace by coincidence. Maybe I'd let my imagination run wild. But even as I thought it, I didn't believe it. The trail curved ahead, winding through a section of tall pines. I came around the bend and stopped cold. He was there, standing in the middle of the trail, maybe 30 yards ahead of me, not walking, not moving, just standing there, facing me, waiting. My blood turned to ice. How had he gotten in front of me? I'd been watching behind me the entire time. There were no shortcuts on this trail. No way he could have passed me without me seeing. It was impossible. I stood frozen, staring at him. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there. And for the first time, I got a clear look at his face. It was wrong, not disfigured or monstrous, just wrong. His expression was completely blank. No curiosity, no anger, no emotion at all. Like looking at a mannequin. And his eyes, even from 30 yards away, I could see that his eyes were dark, empty. They didn't reflect the light the way eyes should. I took a step back. He didn't react. I took another step. He still didn't move. And then I turned and ran. I ran as fast as I could back the way I'd come. I didn't look behind me, didn't check to see if he was following. I just ran. Branches whipped at my face. My pack felt like it weighed 100 pounds. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I don't know how long I ran. 10 minutes, 15. Eventually, I recognized a section of trail I'd passed earlier. I was getting close to the trailhead. I kept running, pushing through the pain, until finally I burst out into the parking lot. My car was still there, the only car in the lot. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. I got the door open, threw my pack in the passenger seat, and jumped in. I locked the doors immediately and sat there, gasping for air, staring at the trailhead. No one came out. I waited 5 minutes, 10, no one. The trail stayed empty. After about 15 minutes, my breathing finally started to return to normal. I looked around the parking lot again. My car was the only one there. There were no other vehicles, no motorcycles, no bikes, nothing. How had he gotten here? If he'd been hiking that trail, his car should be here, unless he'd parked somewhere else. But the nearest other trailhead was miles away. It didn't make sense. I started my car and got out of there. I didn't follow the speed limit on the forest roads. I just drove, putting as much distance between myself and that trailhead as possible. Over the next few days, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe there was another parking area I didn't know about. Maybe he'd been dropped off. Maybe he'd hiked in from a different direction. But none of those explanations felt right. They didn't explain how he'd gotten in front of me. They didn't explain that blank expression, those empty eyes. I reported it to the Forest Service, told them there was someone on the trail acting strangely, possibly following solo hikers. The ranger I spoke to took my information but didn't seem particularly concerned, said they'd increase patrols in that area. I don't know if they did. I looked at maps of the area obsessively for weeks afterward. trying to find some explanation, some connecting trail or shortcut that would explain how he'd gotten ahead of me. But there wasn't one. The trail I'd been on was a simple loop. No connections, no shortcuts. I haven't been back to that trail, haven't been back to George Washington National Forest at all. Every time I think about going, I remember that figure standing in the middle of the path, waiting, and I remember those eyes, dark and empty and wrong. I don't hike alone anymore. When I tell people why, I usually just say I prefer the company. I don't tell them the real reason, because the real reason sounds crazy. The real reason is that I'm afraid I'll look behind me on some trail and see him there again, 50 yards back. Always the same distance, never getting closer, never falling back, just following, waiting for his moment to get ahead of me again, to be standing there when I come around the next bend. Waiting, always waiting. I know the Cherokee National Forest like the back of my hand. I've been hiking those trails since I was a teenager, and over the years, I've done most of them multiple times. There's one particular loop I return to at least twice a year. It's a moderate 10-mile trail that winds through some beautiful old-growth forest and offers decent views from a couple of ridges. I've hiked it in every season. I know every landmark, every turn, every rocky section, or at least, I thought I did. It was mid-October when I decided to do the trail again. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with clear skies and that golden autumn light filtering through the trees. I started early, around 8 in the morning, planning to finish by early afternoon. The parking lot had maybe 3 other cars in it, which was typical for a weekday. The first few miles were exactly as I remembered them. I passed the old boundary marker at mile 1, the split boulder at mile 2, and the massive oak tree with the lightning scar at mile 2.5. Everything was where it should be. I was making good time, feeling strong, enjoying the solitude. Around the 3-mile mark, the trail descends into a small valley before climbing back up the other side. I'd done this section dozens of times. It's a gentle slope down, flat ground for maybe 100 yards, then a steeper climb back up. Simple, straightforward. But this time, when I reached the bottom of the descent, there was something there that shouldn't have been. A stream. I stopped dead in my tracks and stared at it. It was big, maybe 15 feet across, with fast-moving water that looked dark and deep. The sound of it filled the valley, a constant rushing noise that seemed too loud for its size. I stood there, confused. I'd never seen this stream before. Not in summer, not in spring, when the snowmelt would have made any waterways more prominent. Not ever. I pulled out my trail map and checked my position. According to the map, I was exactly where I thought I was. The trail should continue straight across flat ground. There was no stream marked here, no creek, no drainage, nothing. I pulled out my phone and opened the GPS app. It took a minute to load, but when it did, it confirmed what the paper map showed. I was on the right trail, and there was no water feature marked at this location. I looked at the stream again. It was definitely real. I could see it, hear it. The water was moving fast, churning around rocks and fallen branches. But how had I never noticed it before? How had it not been on any map? I walked closer to the edge, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I noticed something that made my skin prickle. The water was flowing the wrong way. I stood there, watching carefully, thinking maybe I was mistaken. Maybe the angle was playing tricks on my eyes. But no, the current was definitely moving uphill. The stream came from the lower part of the valley and flowed up the slope, against gravity. Water doesn't do that. It can't do that. I crouched down, studying the flow more carefully. There was no doubt. The current was moving upward, fighting against the natural laws of physics. Branches and leaves caught in the water were being carried upstream, up the slope, defying everything that made sense. I felt a deep unease settle into my chest. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I reached out and touched the water. The moment my fingers broke the surface, a shock of cold shot up my arm. It wasn't just cold, it was beyond cold. My hand went numb instantly, like I'd plunged it into ice. I jerked it back and looked at my fingers. They were white, bloodless. I shook my hand, trying to get feeling back into it, and backed away from the stream. That's when I saw something move beneath the surface. At first, I thought it was a fish, but as I watched, I realized it was too big to be a fish, too slow. The shape was just under the surface, dark and indistinct, moving against the current with deliberate purpose. And it wasn't alone. There were more of them. 3, 4, maybe more. All moving slowly through the water, their forms barely visible beneath the churning surface. I stood up, my heart starting to beat faster. These weren't fish. The movement was wrong. Too smooth, too purposeful. They looked almost like they were swimming in formation, circling in the deeper sections of the stream. And then one of them surfaced. It was only for a second, maybe less. Just long enough for me to see a dark, slick form break the water. But in that instant, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Eyes. Not the dark, glossy eyes of a fish or the reflective eyes of an otter. These were different. They were large, too large, and they looked directly at me. There was intelligence behind them, awareness, and something else. Something that felt like hunger. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran back the way I'd come, scrambling up the slope I'd just descended. My boots slipped on the loose dirt and leaves, but I didn't slow down. I could hear my breath coming in ragged gasps, could feel my heart pounding against my ribs. I didn't look back. I just ran. I don't know how long it took me to get back to the trailhead. It should have been over an hour at a normal hiking pace, but I covered the distance in maybe 40 minutes. By the time I reached the parking lot, my legs were shaking and my lungs were burning. I bent over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. There was a ranger truck parked near the information board. I saw a ranger, an older guy with gray hair, updating something on the bulletin board. I walked over to him, still breathing hard. "Excuse me," I said. "I need to ask you about something." He turned and looked at me with the patient expression of someone who deals with lost hikers and twisted ankles on a regular basis. "Sure thing. What can I help you with?" "There's a stream," I said, "on the valley section of the ridge trail, about 3 miles in, a big one, fast-moving water, maybe 15 feet across." He frowned slightly. "A stream?" "Yeah, I just came from there, but it's not on the map, and I've hiked that trail dozens of times and never seen it before." His frown deepened. "Son, there's no stream on that trail, never has been. That section runs through a valley, but it's dry. Some seasonal drainage in the spring, maybe, but nothing permanent. Certainly nothing 15 feet wide. I'm telling you, it was there. I saw it. I touched the water." He looked at me for a long moment, his expression shifting from patient to slightly concerned. "You feeling okay? You look pretty shaken up." "I'm fine," I said, though I didn't feel fine. "But I'm telling you what I saw. There was a stream, and the water was flowing uphill, and there were things in it, things that weren't fish." The ranger's expression shifted again. Now he looked at me the way you'd look at someone who'd been out in the sun too long. "Uphill?" "Yes. Against gravity. I know how it sounds, but I saw it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell you what, why don't you show me exactly where you were on the map?" I pulled out my map and showed him. He studied it carefully, then shook his head. "There's nothing there. No water source, no drainage. It's just forest." "Can you come look?" I asked. "I'll show you." He checked his watch. "I've got to finish up here, but I'll send someone out to check the trail this afternoon. Make sure there's no flooding or anything unusual." I thanked him, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He thought I'd gotten confused or dehydrated, that I'd seen something and my tired mind had exaggerated it into something else. I went home, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The stream, the water flowing uphill, those eyes looking at me from beneath the surface. I tried to convince myself that I'd been mistaken, that there was some natural explanation, but I couldn't shake the image. It felt too real, too vivid. The next day, I called my friend Marcus. He's an experienced hiker, someone who wouldn't spook easily. I told him I wanted to check out the trail again, and he agreed to come with me. I didn't tell him why. I just said I wanted company. We hiked out to the 3-mile mark. I was nervous the whole way, not sure what we'd find. Part of me expected to see the stream exactly as I'd left it. Part of me hoped it would be gone, that I really had imagined the whole thing. When we reached the valley, I stopped. Marcus stopped beside me. "What are we looking for?" he asked. I pointed ahead. "There should be a stream. Right there." He looked where I was pointing. There was nothing, just dry ground, fallen leaves, normal forest floor, no water, no rocks wet from spray, no muddy banks, nothing. "I don't see anything," Marcus said. I walked forward slowly, scanning the ground. There should have been some evidence, some sign that water had been here, but there was nothing. The ground was dry, the leaves were crisp and undisturbed. It looked like no water had flowed through here in months, maybe years. I crouched down and touched the ground where I'd stood the day before, where I'd reached down and touched that freezing water. The dirt was dry, powder dry. "Are you sure this is the right spot?" Marcus asked. I looked around. The landmarks were right. The slope, the trees. This was the place, but the stream was gone, like it had never existed. We spent another 20 minutes walking the area, looking for any sign of water. Marcus was patient, but I could tell he thought I was wasting our time. Eventually, we gave up and finished the hike. I haven't been back to that trail since. I've thought about it, thought about going back to that valley to see if the stream appears again, but I can't bring myself to do it, because I know what I saw. I know it was real, and I know that whatever was in that water, whatever surfaced and looked at me with those intelligent, hungry eyes, is still there, somewhere. The rational part of my brain tells me I experienced some kind of hallucination, that maybe I was dehydrated or had altitude sickness or something. But the rest of me, the part that felt that bone-deep cold and saw those shapes moving beneath the surface, knows better. There are places in those mountains that don't follow the rules, places where things exist that shouldn't, where water flows uphill and creatures swim in streams that appear and disappear like they're only half in this world. And I found one of them. I walked right up to it, touched it, looked into its depths, and it looked back. I'd been planning this section of the Appalachian Trail for weeks. It was a straightforward overnight hike in Virginia, about 20 miles total, with a stay at a shelter I'd used before. I'd been there 6 months earlier, in the spring, and it had been perfect. A solid 3-sided shelter with a good roof, a raised sleeping platform, and even a bear box for food storage. Standard AT shelter. Nothing fancy, but reliable. I started the hike around noon on a Saturday in October. The weather was ideal. Clear skies, temperature in the low 60s, and the fall colors were at their peak. I made good time on the trail, stopping occasionally to take photos and enjoy the views. I passed a few other hikers heading in the opposite direction, exchanged the usual trail greetings, and kept moving. By late afternoon, I'd covered about 9 miles. The shelter was just over a mile ahead, and I was looking forward to getting there, setting up for the night, and watching the sunset from the ridge nearby. I'd timed it perfectly. I'd arrived with about an hour of daylight left. As I approached the final stretch of trail leading to the shelter, I noticed something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The forest seemed quieter than it should be. No birds, no rustling in the undergrowth. Just an odd, heavy silence that made me walk a little faster. When I rounded the final bend and saw the shelter, I stopped. Something was wrong. The shelter was there. The 3 walls were standing, weathered but solid. The raised sleeping platform was intact, the wooden planks still in place, but the roof was gone. I stood there, staring at it, trying to process what I was seeing. Not collapsed, not damaged, just absent. The shelter looked like someone had taken a massive saw and cut the roof clean off, leaving the walls and platform perfectly intact. I walked closer, my mind racing. I'd been here 6 months ago. The roof had been fine. A standard pitched roof with wooden shingles, solid and well maintained. I remembered lying on the platform, looking up at the rafters, listening to the rain patter against the shingles. But now there was nothing, just open sky above the 3 walls. I dropped my pack and walked around the structure slowly, examining it from every angle. The walls showed no signs of damage, no splintered wood, no marks that would indicate the roof had been torn off by wind or fallen under its own weight. The top edges of the walls were clean, smooth, like they'd been built that way intentionally, like the shelter had never had a roof at all. I looked around the clearing for debris. If the roof had been removed or had collapsed, there should be something. Broken shingles, torn rafters, something. But the ground around the shelter was clean, just fallen leaves and pine needles. Nothing that suggested a roof had ever been there. I pulled out my map and checked the shelter number. This was definitely the right place. I even checked my photos from my last visit. There it was, the same shelter, same 3 walls, same platform, but with a roof, a clear, solid roof. I looked up at the sky. The sun was getting lower, maybe 45 minutes from sunset. I didn't have time to hike out and find another campsite before dark. And besides, where would I go? The next shelter was 8 miles away. Too far. I decided to stay. The night was supposed to be clear, no rain in the forecast. I could sleep without a roof for one night. It would be fine. I set up my sleeping bag on the platform and organized my gear. I hung my food bag from the bear cables nearby, filled my water bottles from the spring, and made dinner as the light faded. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line, but I never saw anything, just trees and shadows. As darkness settled in completely, I climbed onto the platform and got into my sleeping bag. I lay there, looking up at the sky. The stars were incredible, brighter than I'd ever seen them. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. It was beautiful, but something about it made me uneasy. The stars seemed too close, too present, like they were pressing down on me. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't settle. Every sound seemed amplified, the wind moving through the trees, a branch cracking somewhere in the distance. The normal sounds of the forest at night, but they felt different somehow, wrong. And then I heard the footsteps. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but as I lay there, listening, the sound became unmistakable. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving around the shelter, not through the forest, but around the structure itself, circling it. I sat up slowly, my heart beginning to pound. I looked around the clearing. The moon was up now, nearly full, casting everything in silvery light. I could see clearly. The clearing was empty. No people, no animals, nothing. But the footsteps continued. They moved from the front of the shelter to the side, slow and steady. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound of boots on fallen leaves. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam around the clearing. Nothing. The footsteps didn't pause or change rhythm. They just kept going, circling the shelter in a slow, deliberate pattern. I climbed off the platform and walked to the edge of the shelter, shining my light into the forest. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and undergrowth. Nothing moved, nothing there. But I could still hear the footsteps, clear as day, moving around the shelter, just out of sight. I backed up to the platform and sat down, my flashlight in one hand, my knife in the other. I'm not usually the paranoid type, but every instinct in my body was telling me something was wrong, that I shouldn't be here, that I needed to leave. But leave to where? The forest at night? Without a trail to follow, I'd get lost in minutes. I was stuck here until morning. The footsteps continued for hours. They never stopped, never sped up or slowed down. Just that same steady rhythm, circling the shelter over and over. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, watching the darkness, listening to those impossible footsteps. At some point, deep into the night, I noticed something else. The stars had gotten brighter, so bright they hurt to look at, and they seemed closer now, like they were just above the tree line. I could swear I felt heat coming from them, a warmth that didn't make sense in the cold October night. I looked up, and for a moment, just a brief, disorienting moment, I thought I saw something. Not stars, something else. Shapes moving in the darkness above me, large, silent, impossible to define. But then I blinked and there was nothing, just stars. The footsteps finally stopped sometime around 4 in the morning. The sudden silence was almost worse than the sound had been. I sat there, rigid, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. The forest was quiet, dead quiet. When the first light of dawn started to appear on the horizon, I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made me cry. I'd made it through the night. I quickly packed up my gear, not bothering to organize anything properly. I just stuffed everything into my pack and started hiking out. As I walked away from the shelter, I couldn't help but look back. One last glance, and that's when I saw it. The roof. It was there. For just a second, I saw the pitched roof, the wooden shingles, exactly as I remembered from 6 months ago. But then I blinked, and it was gone again. Just the 3 walls and the open sky. I didn't stop. I didn't go back to investigate. I just kept walking, faster and faster, until I was practically jogging down the trail. I didn't slow down until I'd put at least 3 miles between myself and that shelter. When I got back to the trailhead, I immediately reported the missing roof to the local trail maintenance organization. I called their number and left a message, describing the shelter and explaining that the roof was gone. A few days later, I got a call back. The woman on the phone was friendly but confused. She said they'd sent someone out to check the shelter after my call. The roof was fine, completely intact, no damage, no issues. I tried to explain that I'd been there, that I'd seen it with my own eyes. She politely suggested that maybe I'd been at a different shelter, that maybe I'd gotten confused in the dark, but I knew I hadn't. I'd checked my map multiple times. I'd compared it to my photos. It was the right shelter. I asked her to send me a current photo. She did. It showed the shelter, complete with roof, looking exactly as it should, like nothing had ever been wrong with it. I've tried to make sense of what happened that night. I've researched the history of that shelter, looking for any stories of strange occurrences or unexplained events. I've asked other hikers if they've experienced anything similar. I've come up with a dozen rational explanations, each more desperate than the last. But none of them fit. None of them explain what I saw, what I heard. That roof was gone. I know it was. And those footsteps were real. They circled that shelter for hours, steady and deliberate, even though nothing was there. I haven't been back to that section of the trail. I've hiked other parts of the AT, but I avoid Virginia now, because part of me wonders if the shelter is still there, if the roof is still disappearing and reappearing, if those footsteps are still circling in the night, waiting for the next hiker to arrive. And part of me wonders if I really saw that roof for a second when I looked back, or if my mind was just showing me what I desperately wanted to see. Because the alternative that the shelter exists in two states simultaneously, that it's there and not there at the same time, is too unsettling to accept. But I know what I experienced. I spent a night under open sky in a shelter that should have had a roof. I listened to footsteps that had no source. I felt the stars pressing down on me like they were falling. And I saw something moving in that darkness above. Something that wasn't stars or clouds or anything that belongs in our world. Some places on the trail aren't meant to be stayed at. Some shelters have been there so long, been empty so many nights, that they've started to exist somewhere between what's real and what isn't. And if you're unlucky enough to show up on the wrong night, you might find yourself sleeping somewhere that's only partly in this world. Somewhere the roof comes and goes. Somewhere things circle in the darkness, waiting for something I'm glad I never found out. I've been into photography for about 5 years. Nothing professional, just a hobby I picked up when I realized how therapeutic it was to disconnect from the world and focus on capturing something beautiful. The Blue Ridge Mountains have always been my favorite subject. The way the light hits those ridges in the late afternoon, the way fog settles into the valleys in the morning, it's perfect for landscape photography. I'd planned this particular hike for a Tuesday in late September. Weekday crowds are lighter, and the fall colors were just starting to show. I packed my camera bag, threw in a few extra lenses, and drove out to one of my favorite trailheads. The parking lot was nearly empty. Just my car and one other vehicle, which was perfect. The trail I'd chosen was a moderate 6-mile out and back that led to a nice overlook. I'd done it before, but never with serious photography in mind. This time, I was planning to take my time, stop frequently, and really work on composition and lighting. The weather was ideal. Clear sky, temperature in the mid-60s, and just enough breeze to keep things comfortable. I started hiking around 10 in the morning, my camera already out and ready. I'm one of those people who takes way too many photos. I'll shoot the same scene from 10 different angles, adjusting settings, trying different exposures. It's excessive, but that's how I learn. For the first hour, I stopped every few minutes. A particularly interesting tree trunk with lichen growing on it, the trail winding through a section of tall pines, a spider web with dewdrops catching the light. I was in my zone, completely focused on the photography, barely paying attention to how far I was walking. Around midday, I reached the overlook. It was spectacular. The trail opened up onto a rocky outcrop that gave a clear view across the valley to the mountain ranges beyond. The light was perfect. I spent maybe 20 minutes there, shooting from different positions, trying to capture the sense of depth and scale. I took a few photos of the valley, then turned and took some shots back toward the trail, showing the rocky outcrop and the trees framing the path. I checked my LCD screen, reviewed a few images, and decided I was happy with what I'd captured. I packed my camera carefully into my bag and started hiking back. The hike back was uneventful. I stopped a few more times to take shots, but I was starting to feel tired and hungry. By the time I reached the trailhead around 3 in the afternoon, I was ready to head to my campsite, set up for the night, and go through my photos. I'd reserved a spot at a small campground about 15 minutes from the trailhead. It was primitive, just a cleared area with a fire ring and a picnic table, but it was cheap and quiet. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and made dinner as the sun began to set. After I ate, I pulled out my camera and started reviewing the day's photos on the LCD screen. I'd shot about 200 images, which was typical for me. Most would be trash, but hopefully there'd be a dozen or so worth keeping. I scrolled through them chronologically. The tree trunk shots looked good. The spider web was overexposed. The trail through the pines was nice, but nothing special. I kept scrolling, occasionally stopping to zoom in and check focus and detail. That's when I saw it, a photo I didn't remember taking. It was mixed in with the others, the timestamp showing it was taken around 12:15 p.m., right around the time I'd been at the overlook. The image showed the trail, the same section I'd been photographing, but there was something in it, someone, a figure standing on the trail, maybe 30 feet from where I must have been standing, wearing a dark jacket or coat, with the hood pulled up, no visible face, just the hood, creating a dark shadow where the face should be. I stared at the screen, confused. I didn't remember seeing anyone. I didn't remember taking this photo, but there it was. Same timestamp as the other overlook photos. Same settings. Same location data in the EXIF data. I zoomed in on the figure. The image was sharp, in focus. The person was clearly standing there, facing the camera, facing me, but I had no memory of it, none. I felt a chill run through me despite the warmth from the fire. I scrolled back through the previous photos, the ones I'd taken on the way to the overlook. In the next one, there was the figure again. Further back this time, maybe 50 yards away, but definitely there, standing just off the trail, barely visible among the trees. My heart started beating faster. I scrolled forward. The next photo showed the figure closer, and the next one closer still. In each image, the hooded figure was advancing toward my position, always facing the camera, always in focus. I kept scrolling, my hands starting to shake. The photos continued in sequence, the figure getting progressively closer in each one. In some images, they were partially obscured by trees or shadows, but they were always there, always moving closer. When I reached the photos from the overlook, the ones I'd carefully composed of the valley view, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. In the background of one shot, just visible at the edge of the frame, was the figure. They were standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 20 feet behind where I'd been standing. I scrolled to the next image, a photo I'd taken looking back toward the trail, showing the rocky outcrop and the path. The figure was in this one too, much closer now, standing on the trail itself, maybe 10 feet from my position. And then I came to the last photo I'd taken at the overlook, a simple shot of the trail leading back into the forest. I zoomed in and felt my breath catch in my throat. The figure was right there, right behind where I must have been standing. So close they could have reached out and touched me. The hood was still up, the face still hidden in shadow, but the posture was clear. They were standing directly behind me, maybe 3 feet away, facing the same direction as the camera. I dropped the camera like it had burned me. It landed on the picnic table with a clatter. I stood up, backing away from it, my mind reeling. I'd been alone on that trail. I was sure of it. I'd seen no one, heard no one. The trail had been empty except for me. But the photos didn't lie. Someone had been there. Someone had been following me, getting closer with each shot. And in that last photo, they'd been standing right behind me. I forced myself to pick up the camera again. I needed to understand this. I scrolled through the photos one more time, this time paying attention to every detail. The figure appeared in 23 images total. In the early photos, they were distant, barely noticeable. But as I'd moved along the trail, they'd gotten closer and closer. And then I noticed something else. Something that made everything so much worse. In the photos where the figure was closest, where they were just a few feet away, there was something about the angle, about the perspective. These photos weren't taken from my eye level. They were taken from slightly above and to the side, like someone else had been holding the camera, like someone else had taken the photos. My hands were trembling as I checked the EXIF data again. The timestamps were all within the sequence of my other photos. The GPS coordinates matched my location. The camera settings were identical to what I'd been using. But these photos, someone else had taken them. I stood there by the fire, trying to process what this meant. Had someone taken my camera when I wasn't looking, Had someone been standing right next to me, taking photos while I was shooting, and I somehow didn't notice? No, that was impossible. I'd had the camera around my neck the entire time. I never set it down, never walked away from it. I scrolled to the very last photo again, the one showing the figure right behind me. I zoomed in as far as the camera would allow, studying every detail. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before. The shadow. My shadow was visible in the photo, cast by the midday sun, but the figure had no shadow. They were standing in direct sunlight, right behind me, close enough that our shadows should have been touching, but there was nothing. Just empty ground where their shadow should have been. I deleted the photo immediately. Then I deleted the next one, and the next. I went through the entire memory card and deleted every image that showed the figure. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the camera twice. When I finished, I checked the card. 177 images remaining. 23 deleted. I turned off the camera and put it back in my bag. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, feeding it wood, keeping it burning bright. Every sound in the darkness made me jump. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch. I kept thinking about that figure, about how close they'd been, about how I hadn't seen them, hadn't heard them, hadn't known they were there. At first light, I packed up and drove home. I didn't stop except for gas. When I got to my apartment, I pulled out the memory card and connected it to my computer, intending to back up the remaining photos. That's when I saw them again. The deleted photos were back, all 23 of them. Same timestamps, same images, the figure getting closer and closer. And at the end, that final photo, the figure standing right behind me, shadowless and faceless. I ejected the memory card and put it in a drawer. I haven't opened that drawer since. Haven't touched that memory card. Haven't looked at those photos again. But I think about them all the time. I think about that figure following me up the trail, getting closer with every step, standing behind me at the overlook, close enough to whisper in my ear. And I think about the fact that I didn't take those photos. I couldn't have. The angles were wrong. The perspective was wrong. Someone else took them. Someone who was right there with me, invisible and silent, documenting my hike from their perspective. I haven't been back to that trail. Haven't been to the Blue Ridge Mountains at all. I barely touch my camera anymore, because every time I pick it up, I wonder if someone else is going to take photos that I don't remember. Photos that show me things I shouldn't see. And late at night, when I'm lying in bed trying to sleep, I wonder about that last photo, the one showing the figure right behind me. And I wonder if they were that close. Why didn't they do something? Why just stand there and watch? What were they waiting for? Or maybe they did do something. Maybe they did exactly what they wanted. Because now, months later, I still feel it sometimes. That sense of someone standing just behind me, just out of sight, close enough to touch. And I wonder if they ever left, or if they're still there, following me, taking photos I'll never see until it's too late. I'd chosen the Jefferson National Forest for a simple day hike on a Thursday in early November. I wasn't looking for anything challenging, just a chance to get out of the house and clear my head after a stressful week. The trail I picked was one I'd never done before, but the reviews online made it sound perfect. Well-marked, moderate difficulty, good views, nothing complicated. I arrived at the trailhead around 9 in the morning. The parking lot had 2 other cars in it, which was fine. I prefer some solitude when I hike, but a little company never hurt. I locked my car, shouldered my small pack, and started walking. The trail was exactly as described. Wide, well-maintained, with white blazes painted on trees every 100 feet or so. The blazes were the standard rectangular markers used on trails throughout Virginia, about 6 inches tall, painted white, impossible to miss. As long as you followed the blazes, you couldn't get lost. The forest was beautiful. The leaves were mostly down by this point in the season, carpeting the ground in browns and reds. The bare trees let in more light than usual, giving everything a stark, clean quality. I settled into a comfortable pace, enjoying the quiet rhythm of walking. About an hour in, maybe a little more, I noticed something odd. There was a blaze on a tree, but it wasn't on the trail. It was about 20 feet off to my left, painted on an oak tree that stood alone in a small cluster of saplings. I stopped and stared at it. Trail blazes are always positioned on the trail itself, or close enough that you'd naturally see them while walking. They're meant to guide you, to confirm you're going the right way. A blaze 20 feet off the trail didn't make sense. It would be useless as a marker. I walked over to it, curious. It looked like the other blazes, same size, same white paint. It even looked fresh, like it had been painted recently. I looked around, trying to figure out why it would be here. Maybe this tree had been on the trail at some point, and the trail had been rerouted, but that didn't explain why the blaze looked so new. I shrugged it off and walked back to the main trail. Probably just a mistake. Someone practicing their painting technique or something. I kept hiking. 10 minutes later, I saw another one. This blaze was further off the trail, maybe 30 feet into the woods, painted on a pine tree. I stopped and stared at it. This wasn't a coincidence. Two blazes in the wrong place, both within a short stretch of trail. That was deliberate. I stood there for a moment, debating. Part of me wanted to ignore it and keep hiking, but another part of me was curious. Where were these blazes leading? Was there an old trail branching off here that wasn't on the map? Some abandoned path that predated the current trail system? I decided to follow them, just to see where they went. If it got too sketchy, I'd turn back. I stepped off the main trail and walked toward the blaze on the pine tree. The ground was rougher here, covered in fallen branches and uneven terrain. No established path, just forest floor. When I reached the pine tree, I looked around and spotted another blaze. This one was about 40 feet ahead, painted on a poplar. I kept walking, following the blazes deeper into the forest. They appeared every 30 or 40 feet, always just visible from the previous one. Whoever had painted them knew what they were doing. The spacing was perfect, professional, almost. But the direction was wrong. We were moving away from the main trail, heading into a section of forest that looked untouched. The trees got thicker, older. The undergrowth became denser. I had to push through branches and step over logs. This wasn't a maintained trail. This was wilderness. After about 10 minutes of following the blazes, I started to feel uneasy. Something about this didn't feel right. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, just silence and the sound of my own footsteps crunching through dead leaves. I stopped and looked back. I could still see some of the blazes I'd passed, white rectangles marking my path. I could follow them back to the main trail easily enough. But ahead, I could see one more blaze, and beyond it, what looked like a small clearing. I decided to check out the clearing, then turn back. I pushed through the last section of undergrowth and stepped into an open area maybe 30 feet across. The ground here was relatively flat, covered in leaves and moss, and in the center of the clearing was something that made me stop cold. A cairn, a pile of rocks, stacked carefully one on top of another, rising about 3 feet high. The rocks were arranged in perfect balance, each one placed with obvious care and precision. It looked like something you'd see on a mountain summit or at a trail junction. A marker, a memorial, something deliberate. I walked toward it slowly. Something about it felt wrong. Cairns are usually built by hikers, left as waypoints or simple expressions of, "I was here." But this was in the middle of nowhere, off any established trail, in a clearing that showed no signs of regular human activity. As I got closer, I saw something on top of the cairn, a piece of paper, folded once, held down by a small rock. My instincts told me to turn around and leave, but curiosity overrode caution. I reached out and picked up the paper. It was thick, like cardstock, not regular notebook paper. I unfolded it. Written in the center, in neat block letters, was my name, my full name, first, middle, and last. My heart stopped. I stared at the paper, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. How was my name here? I hadn't told anyone I was hiking this trail. I'd barely decided to come here myself until last night. And this paper looked old, not brand new. The edges were slightly worn, like it had been sitting here for a while. I flipped it over. The other side was blank. I looked around the clearing, suddenly feeling very exposed, very watched. There was no one there, no movement, no sound, just trees and shadows and that terrible silence. I dropped the paper and backed away from the cairn. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I needed to get back to the main trail, back to other people, back to reality. I turned and started walking quickly back the way I'd come, following the white blazes in reverse. My breath was coming faster now. My hands were shaking. I pushed through branches, not caring when they scratched my face and arms. I just needed to get out of here. But as I walked, something felt wrong. The blazes didn't look the same. The spacing felt different. I stopped and looked around. I should be seeing familiar trees, familiar landmarks, but everything looked strange, unfamiliar. I pulled out my phone. No signal, which wasn't surprising this deep in the forest. But I had GPS. I opened my hiking app and checked my position. According to the GPS, I was about a quarter mile from the main trail, but the direction was wrong. I should be west of the trail, heading back toward it. But the GPS showed me northwest, parallel to the trail rather than moving toward it. That didn't make sense. I'd been following the blazes backward. I should be retracing my steps exactly. I looked around again and spotted a white blaze on a nearby tree. But as I stared at it, something seemed off. The shape was slightly wrong. The paint looked different. This wasn't the same blaze I'd followed in. I started walking faster, following my GPS rather than the blazes. The forest seemed to press in closer. The trees were so thick now I could barely see more than 20 feet in any direction. I pushed through undergrowth, climbed over fallen logs, forced my way through dense patches of saplings. After what felt like forever but was probably only 15 minutes, I burst through a line of trees and stumbled onto a trail. I bent over, gasping for breath, relief flooding through me. I'd made it back. But as I stood there, catching my breath, I realized something. This wasn't the same trail I'd left. The path was different, narrower. The blazes were different too, yellow instead of white. I was on the wrong trail. I pulled out my phone again and checked the map. According to the GPS, I was about a mile from where I'd started. The yellow blaze trail I was on ran roughly parallel to the white blaze trail I'd been hiking, but they didn't intersect for several miles. How had I ended up here? I'd been following the white blazes backward. They should have led me back to the white trail, not to a completely different trail a mile away. I didn't care anymore. I just wanted out. I started jogging down the yellow trail, heading south toward the parking area. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead, which turned out to be a different trailhead from where I'd started, about 2 miles down the road from my car. I walked along the road until I reached my car. My hands were still shaking as I unlocked it and got inside. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, trying to calm down. That evening, back at home, I pulled up detailed maps of the Jefferson National Forest online. I found the white blaze trail I'd been hiking. I found the yellow blaze trail I'd ended up on, and I tried to find the clearing. I used satellite imagery, topographic maps, trail databases. I spent hours searching. The clearing wasn't there. According to every map I could find, the area where I'd been was just forest. No clearings, no landmarks, nothing. But I'd been there, I'd seen the cairn, I'd held the paper with my name on it. Over the next few days, I kept coming back to one question. How did that paper have my name on it? The only explanations I could come up with were impossible. Either someone had been following me and placed it there knowing I'd find it, which would require knowing exactly where I'd hike and when I'd decide to follow those off-trail blazes, or the paper had been there waiting for me specifically, placed there before I'd even decided to hike that trail. Both options were impossible, but one of them had happened. I thought about going back, about trying to find that clearing again, to prove to myself it was real, but I couldn't bring myself to do it, because part of me knew that if I went back and followed those white blazes again, they wouldn't lead me to the same place. They'd lead me somewhere else, somewhere deeper, and there'd be another cairn, and another piece of paper, and maybe this time, there'd be more than just my name. I still hike, but I don't follow blazes that are off the trail anymore, even when they're spaced perfectly, even when they look professional and deliberate, because I know now that some trails don't lead where you think they do. Some markers guide you to places that aren't on any map, places that know you're coming, places that have been waiting. And whatever was waiting in that clearing, whatever knew my name and built that cairn, is still out there, still painting blazes on trees, still leading hikers off the main trail into the deep woods to clearings that exist and don't exist, waiting for the next person to be curious enough to follow, waiting to show them their name, written on paper, sitting on a pile of rocks in a place that shouldn't be there. I was lucky. I ran. But I think about the other hikers who might not run, who might pick up that paper and keep looking, keep searching for answers. and I wonder what they find when they do. What waits for them in the next clearing, or the one after that.